guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. So I've had a chance, I think, to walk around and talk to a lot of you. It's been a really wonderful conference thus far, so I hope you guys have been enjoying it as much as I have. I'm excited to see that sessions are being videotaped because I have wanted to see so many sessions and have not been able to do so because I've been presenting. So I get to watch the video, just like a great, great thing. So just before I begin, how many of you were with me yesterday when I was doing RTFI Now What? Can you raise it nice and, okay, all right, okay, perfect. That helps me kind of frame some of my talking points. So I do have a lot of new faces, and I'm not surprised. I mean, the topic is, I think, of high interest, barriers. We all experience barriers for implementation. So my goal is to really talk about how do you remove those barriers that are impeding your ability to implement evidence-based practices. And I'm going to frame that in particular around reading. So reading, literacy practices, since this conference has a lot to do with literacy. But before I begin, I just want to formally introduce myself to all of you. My name is Kim St. Martin, and my current role is I'm the Assistant Director of Pre-Correct, this is a mouthful, Michigan's Integrated Behavior Learning Support Initiative, AKA MyBLISSy. And who are my PBIS, Positive Behavioral Intervention Support people? Okay, a couple of you. So you all know then Rob Horner. Anyone who knows PBIS, Rob Horner is considered one of the founding fathers, if you will, of PBIS. Rob has been supporting our state project for years, since we came into being before 2003. And when Rob found out the name that was granted to us, his reply was, "I am so sorry. These people are just not going to remember that or know how to pronounce that." So, so my role is the assistant director. Prior to my role, I was a building administrator. I have been a teacher. I started my teaching career in the City School District of Philadelphia, and then moved from Pennsylvania to Michigan, where I taught in a very rural, small school district, like a PK-12 building, Covert Public Schools. It's right near the lakeshore, Lake Michigan. And we had a lot of migrant families. There are a lot of blueberry farms there. So we have a lot of kids that would come and they would go during the blueberry picking season. And so I have always been in schools or in districts where almost all of the kids qualify for free or reduced lunch. So my heart and my experience has always been with at-risk youth and really trying to figure out how do we accelerate the reading outcomes for those kids. And so I am here really to talk about implementation barriers. I do want to make sure you can access the presentation materials. If you go online to Ohio Department, like the literacy website, the second slide has the link to all the materials. I've given you access to a Google folder where you can see some of the resources that I'm referencing. You actually will have access to the resources for this session as well as what I referenced in the previous session. So for those of you who had raised your hands earlier, it's the same exact folder that you were accessing yesterday. It's just the second folder that is the name of this session, okay? Anyone can access this folder. If you give them the link, they can access it. I haven't personally invited people, so if you have colleagues that are not here and you say, ooh, John or Sue would really benefit from this, you can share this PowerPoint slide and they too could access the information. I have 4 main outcomes that I hope to achieve, and I'm going to spend most of my time on the 4th outcome. I actually have 5 outcomes. The first one is that I want to talk about the steps in a barrier removal process. I want to define kind of the components and steps of a barrier removal process. It seemed kind of strange to have a session on how to address barriers if we didn't talk about a process that should be put in place at a district level so that barriers that exist across schools within a district can be efficiently identified and effectively removed. So I'm going to start the session session identifying a barrier removal process. And in that Google folder, I have an example of a district, it's a real example, and I also have something called a barrier log, where these folks actually, this district, logs the barriers that are impeding their implementation, and they are able to keep track of those things to ensure that the barriers are in fact being removed. After we talk about the components of a barrier removal process, I provide you an example, I'm going to just have a slide that is going to outline the 5 most common implementation barriers. This is not an exhaustive list. There were probably several more that I could have sat down and could have added to the list. But I feel like the 5 that are identified are the most common out there. And then I'm going to spend most of the time addressing barrier number 1. Barrier number 1, a little bit of foreshadowing, it has to do with a lack of understanding of what scientifically valid reading practices are. Because that seems to be the biggest implementation barrier that prevents other barriers from being identified and addressed. And so I'm going to talk a lot about what scientifically valid reading practices are, and I'm going to juxtapose scientifically valid reading practices to scientifically invalid reading practices, 2 of the most common that I hear within some of the districts and states that I support. The last piece is that because I'm not going to spend too much time on barriers 2 through 5, I do outline the barrier and I give you bulleted solutions for addressing the barrier. And so, in the last session, the morning session, we were able to get through all the slides. We just dug in deeper around scientifically valid reading practices. All right, so here are the common reading barriers, okay? So, and the way the room is set up, I know for the poor cameraman, it's hard for me to keep walking in front, but I feel like I'm neglecting this side of the room if I don't change my location. So here are the 5 implementation barriers. Insufficient understanding of scientifically valid reading practices, okay? And then the second common one has to do with curriculum resources that do not support scientifically valid reading practices. And so these actually are sequenced very, very intentionally. If you don't know what scientifically valid practices are, you certainly aren't going to have the necessary knowledge to detect if what you have, it does support or does not support those best practices. The third common implementation barrier has to do with insufficient administrative support and monitoring to ensure that the curriculum resource materials that are in the hands of teachers are being taught as intended and on a regular basis. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. For number 4, has to do with insufficient understanding of assessments and how to act on assessment data to inform instruction. And then last but not least has to do with an insufficient infrastructure to support the things that are being used in all the teachers that are within a school district. Now, for those of you who were with me yesterday, I started the session by saying that I love a quote by Mike Schmoker. It's on page 2 of the book Results Now, and it says, "You place a good person in a bad system, the system wins every time." And I really believe that that's true. I experienced that in Philadelphia especially. There was absolutely no system to support teachers. I saw what I believed to be really good teachers, some of whom were having a nervous breakdown because of the behaviors that they were seeing in the classrooms, because of the wide range of student ability of the students that they were expected to support. I actually took over for, by the time I got my provisional teaching certificate in the state of Pennsylvania, because I had my degree in New York State, had a New York teaching certificate. By the time I got my degree in Pennsylvania, I took over for a teacher in 3rd grade who left because she had a nervous breakdown because of the 32 kids that were in the room. And so I believe that if there was a good support structure in place, fewer teachers would actually be making the decision to leave the profession. And right now, we have an issue with that. We have a lot of teachers that are choosing to leave the profession only after a few years. And that's just not good for them, and it's not good for our kids. But the issue is that we don't want to develop a really good system around garbage. I mean, think about it. If we're not developing a system around stuff that is proven to be effective, empirically proven to be effective in improving outcomes, why would we want well-organized garbage? We wouldn't. So even though that is listed as number 5, it's intentionally there because you want to build a system around good stuff. So you want to build a system around things that are predicated on scientifically valid reading practices. You want to select good things to put in the hands of teachers. You want to select good assessments so that teachers can teach them how to use those things to adjust instruction. And then you build an infrastructure to support everyone. So let's dig into barrier removal process. So I want to just give a little bit of context to our state and the supports that we provide. So we, as a state project, have a multi-year scope and sequence of professional learning. And the goal of that professional learning is so that elementary and middle schools can implement the behavior components of a multi-tiered system of support, so that's positive behavioral intervention supports, and the reading components of a multi-tiered system of support. And so that is predicated on scientifically valid reading practices, aligning with the big ideas of reading at the elementary level and the big ideas of adolescent reading at the secondary level. But the third piece that is very unique to our state is that we also have a scope and sequence of professional learning for district teams. So you guys in this state typically refer to them as DLTs, district leadership teams. In our state, we commonly refer to them as district implementation teams. And so when a district says, wants to work with our state project, we have a scope and sequence of professional learning that begins with a district implementation team. And the purpose of that learning is to teach the district how to put in place an implementation infrastructure that is going to support the use of high-quality, evidence-based practices, programs, and assessments across all schools. The goal is to use these things with fidelity, use them very well, scale up sustain their use and scale up their use across the grade levels within a district. This can't happen if districts don't have an implementation infrastructure. And so the very first year, we have 4 professional learning days that are devoted to district implementation teams. 3 of their 4 days occur in the fall of the first year. 1 month in September, that's session 1, session 2 in October, session 3 in November, and then we don't do the final 4th session of their first year until April, around April, May. And so the barrier removal process is one module of the learning. It is addressed actually in their 2nd day, so October, it's the 2nd time that we meet with them. And we teach them how to develop both a communication plan and a process to address barriers. We connect these two because you can't have a process to identify and address barriers if you don't have a good communication system in place. If you don't have a process by which you are systematically communicating with various groups and teams whose work is touching on the evidence-based practices, programs, and assessment strategies that a district is working to support people in implementing. So we very much connect the barrier removal process to communication. So if some of you are familiar with our website. I have Elizabeth, can you raise your hand? Elizabeth has printed everything off our website and put it in a pretty binder. She knows more about what is on our website than I do. I actually took a picture of it and showed it at our all-unit staff meeting and said, come on, guys, we have to step it up. Elizabeth is showing us up. And so if you go on our website and you access professional learning, and if you're looking for the website, you would just have to Google My Blissy. Remember that really, you could probably bastardize it and it's still gonna get you there. MIBLSI. If you just put that acronym in, we are the first thing that pops up on Google, okay? And so if you go to our website and you click on the sidebar that talks about training materials or professional learning, and you click on our My Blissy integrated model of support, you'll see a scope and sequence for district implementation teams, for districts. And we have listed all of those modules that we use across all the years that we work with a district. This module on communication and barrier removal is module 5. And that is easily identifiable because we have listed next to each module a title of what you're going to see, okay? So here's the big idea of what a barrier removal process is. Very simply, it outlines the steps that need to be taken from the point at which a district team is made aware of a barrier. So district team is aware that a barrier has occurred. So it begins at that point in which there is awareness by this team, and it outlines each of the steps to the point at which not only has the barrier been removed, but there's been follow-up about a couple weeks or month later to make sure that the way in which the barrier was removed actually worked. Because is it possible that some people, good intention, have thought they addressed a barrier, and then we know within 24 to 48 hours it is not working? Yes or no, everyone? Yes, absolutely. So this barrier removal process teases out every single one of those steps. So here are what the critical steps should be. Here's what they should include. The very first one is you got to identify the venue in which the barriers can actually be openly discussed. Now, I warn folks, especially in the state of Ohio, about this because some of the DLTs out there include parents. Now, I am not saying that DLTs should not include parents. Don't misunderstand me. But there are barriers that could touch on personnel issues, issues that are very confidential that you would not put forth in front of parents, that really could be communicated to others in the community, and let's hope this doesn't happen. It could be posted on like the community Facebook page. So I just want to be very careful that you have to identify the venue at which these barriers can be openly and honestly discussed. It also has to identify how the barrier is going to be recorded. We encourage a log of barriers. And not only do you log the barriers that are currently in the hopper, if you will, to be addressed, but you log which step it is currently in the process. Now that's a really important thing because when you're building an infrastructure, you should always test your infrastructure. And so by identifying your barriers and keeping track of where it is in the process, if you have a barrier that gets hung up in step 2, and it's been 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks, there's an issue with step 2. We should probably look at step 2 because it's not, whatever way we fleshed out that step in the process, there's a log jam. It's not moving forward, okay? So we very much ask people to record the barrier, record which step in the process that barrier is located. It also has to include a designee from the team who's going to be responsible for bringing the barrier to the individual who's been identified with the highest level of decision-making authority necessary to remove the barrier. So I'm going to be very careful about how I phrase that. We're not talking about everything going directly to the superintendent. Now, there are times, and I have the gift of working with small districts in the Upper Peninsula, in the thumb of our district. We have districts whose superintendents are the bus driver. They serve the food. They are also the principal of the K-12 building. And so it is possible that you have one executive leader in your district who you need to actually bring the barrier to. But in districts, in larger districts, there are typically different layers of directors or central office type staff who actually do have decision-making authority to address things like instruction, things like curriculum, things like the use of special education funds. And so we're not saying that every barrier has to go right to the number one in charge, okay? The process also includes steps that will be taken to address the barrier. Once that person has it, what is he or she going to do to take it from there? And timelines. When can there be follow-up? It ends with these final 2 steps. When it identifies the venue in which the barrier, like a status update, can be provided to check in and monitor the progress of removing barriers. And it identifies who and how there's going to be follow-up, perhaps a couple weeks or a month after, to make sure the way in which the barrier was addressed actually resulted in it being removed. Okay? So before I go any farther, I want you to think about the district that you currently work in or your current role. Some of you are here from ESCs, SSTs. To what extent do you have a barrier removal process, and does it include any of these steps? Go ahead and talk with people around you, and then we will move forward. Okay, I'm going to bring you guys back together. Let me get you into, okay. Let me bring you back together. May I have your attention, please? So I'm in the Google folder now. Before I move forward, a good question came up from Lindsay, who really talked about, well, so what constitutes a barrier? And that is a really good thing to flush out. So at our district implementation team level and our BLT level, those folks identify how decisions are made. Because there are decisions and barriers that can be removed by the building administrator. There are some things that he or she can address and remove. But it should be very clear to the district team, to the administrators, to the BLTs, where is the line in the sand? At what point does this become big enough of an issue where it has to be lifted to someone outside of the building administrator? So a good example of that, and some of this is contextual based on the district. So a good example has to do with the special schedule. For my elementary, I used to have to create the special schedule for the district. And there's a reason why they call it the special schedule. It is special. And so, but truth be told, when buildings share special teachers, something like creating an uninterrupted reading block will impact when specials can happen. And that typically has a domino effect across multiple buildings, perhaps at the same level, elementary, but even could push on secondary as well. So there are circumstances where I, as an administrator, could make some decisions for my building, but then the devil's in the details. Once we start to flesh that out, I realize quickly this is going to have a bigger domino effect that warrants it being raised to a higher level where I need to get the other administrators involved, and if it's going to push on more sections and increase special teachers FTE, because we had part-time special teachers. So if you're giving them more travel blocks of time in between buildings, it pushes on resources. So you can see how something that seems to be so innocent, like a building administrator working on a common reading schedule, could have ramifications that would need to be lifted to someone with higher levels of decision-making authority. But the point is well taken that any little barrier everything doesn't get funneled up to a district team. But it's important that the administrator and his or her BLT and the staff understand what are those decisions and barriers that we as a building through our leader can address, and what are those scenarios that where we can expect more time is needed to get to the right people and address to remove the barrier. Okay, so that was a great point that Lindsay raised. So in the Google folder, you have a couple of documents. The first one is a barrier log. This is an actual log from a district. I want to give credit to Chippewa Hills School District. They're in northern Michigan. They have one superintendent. They have no assistant superintendent, no curriculum director. They have a building administrator who is also a district special ed director. And Bob is the superintendent. So you see Bob's name on a lot. That's because Bob is like the number one. He has a team of really one in terms of cabinet level people. They have four elementary schools, and they have a feeder middle school, feeder high school, and they have one small alternative education setting, okay? So this document here is their district implementation team's pre-meeting document. So what we try to teach district teams to do is meet on a regular basis, preferably monthly, and rather than always put it on one poor soul to have to do an all call for agenda items and have to create the agenda, we have them create a tab for every district team meeting that will occur. And what they do is they have on there the common topics that they talk about. So these things along the top stay stagnant. So they are always, and if there's anything that needs to be contextualized that fits in within these categories, it gets added. Anyone on the district team can add information. Celebration, can add a deepening team knowledge, can add a note about upcoming professional learning that school teams or BLTs are accessing, can add implementation challenges, also known as barriers, can add an initiative or a program review to consider. Because the truth is that these folks are, so this district, given the context, they have to have an initiative program review because of the fact that they are in the process of selecting new core reading curriculum materials. They're deselecting assessments. So this has to be a standing meeting agenda item for their district team. And they have their communication. Here are the need-to-knows. MDE, ISD information and timelines, board or other groups and stakeholders, and they have a category for other. So this is something that they have for every month. Now, their barrier removal log is one tab there because implementation challenges are addressed every month. And you can see that along the top row, they've got the date at which a barrier was added. They've got whether or not it was busted. They have, in each of their steps corresponds to a column. So this district has one step. For step 1 is row C. They've got step 2 is the person assigned. So you can see very systematically, this is how they are documenting progress and holding people accountable. Now, Tawny and Sarah are two of my staff members because they are leveraging our staff who are teaching them how to do this work. Bob is the superintendent, okay? The other document I want you to see is the actual example. So it starts with part 2 because of the fact that if you remember, this module is with communication. We teach them to put their barrier removal process into their communication plan. Like, they two go hand in hand. Part 1 is communication plan. Here's the steps. Here's who we communicate to. Here are the need-to-knows across our team. And then part 2 is the process for addressing barriers. Now, some people say, well, this looks awfully complicated. Well, I mean, the truth is that this is getting at sustainability. if, God forbid, if Bob were to go away and like people won the lottery and decided, like they all went on a ticket and they suddenly don't show up on Monday, there is now a record. We have institutionalized the communication process. We've institutionalized the process for addressing barriers. And so we do have to write things down. Writing things down increases the likelihood that we're going to do them and that we're going to sustain them. So this outlines their process. That link to barriers links them right to the log. So if you click on it, you go right back to that barrier removal log that I gave you access, that you have in your Google folder, okay? All right, so what I'd like you to do now is to think about, like you're kind of scrolling through the log, you're scrolling through the process. What are some steps that you can take following this session to kind of plant some seeds or move forward in thinking about shaping your district's barrier removal process? Go ahead and talk for a few minutes, and then we'll come back together and move on to barrier number 1. Everyone back together. May I have your attention, please? So, couple of things that we talked about as I was walking around. One is timing. So if you have a new superintendent and you have access to that person, like this could be good. I mean, you know, like especially if you come from an environment where there isn't a lot of formal processes. One of the recommendations I gave though is always give a new person at least 9 months to get his or her legs underneath them. Even us as a state project, we really struggle to agree to work with districts if they either are missing their leader because he or she has left, or I mean, we have one situation where superintendent, it sounds like, was removed, and so building administrators are sharing superintendent responsibilities. We have another situation where the person who wants to work with us is retiring in July. And so those are not really good times to enter into a 4-year agreement of like scope and sequence of professional learning for a district team and school teams. So timing is everything. But I did also mention that some people said, wow, lots of applicability at like a regional level, ESC level, or an SST level. This same communication and barrier removal process that we teach at a district level can also be applied at a regional level as well. A lot of barriers tend to be informally addressed based on who you have access to, who you see, the water cooler kind of conversations, informal conversations. And we're trying to take some of what typically is referred to as informal and make it systematic, make it formal. And some people, depending upon the culture of a district, say, why formality? I get that a lot in the Upper Peninsula. Some people say, no, we're really kind of go with the flow. Why do we have to be so formal? Writing something down does not mean that you're being formal. Like you're actually creating an institutional memory of it. And I don't know about you, if there is more than 3 steps to anything, I'm likely to forget the 3 steps. And so it is probably good if we write those things down. Now, how explicit you need to be is a different situation, is a different story. But nonetheless, it's we certainly want to write these things down. So, all right, so we've done our due diligence in talking about what constitutes a barrier removal process. And so pretend we have a barrier removal process in place, okay? So now we're just gonna talk about the barriers. And I'm gonna spend most of my time with barrier number 1. Barrier number 1 is insufficient understanding of scientifically valid reading practices. I see this so often. And it is, it's awkward because I can tell based on things that are being used. I can even tell based on some small words that are said that would flag me into whether or not this notion of scientifically valid practices are or are not an issue. And so here's the solution to address that barrier. It seems pretty obvious, but not so much. You've got to teach people. You have to give them access to professional learning, period. It has to happen. The second one is really important. We have to safeguard people against conflicting messages. That happens all the time. So 2 true stories. Years ago, I was working with a district. Administrative team, superintendent and assistant superintendent agreed we are going to support scientifically valid reading practices. They had a meeting of the minds to make sure that they were a united front. I'm a big believer that that is important. The administrators the superintendent has to have the back of the administrators. The administrators has to have the back of central office. It's mutual. You have to have each other's backs. So they had a meeting of the mind, and they agreed, this is our messaging, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it. Well, what happened was they literally left the meeting, and the next day, one of the administrators did a book study that was opposite of everything they are going to be implementing as a district. Opposite. And sadly, this administrator knew that it was opposite. This was a district that was used to a lot of site-based management. You know, I can go back in my building, shut the door, and I could do what I want, and no one's really going to do anything. And so, as you can imagine, it created a lot of issues for the teachers, it created issues for the other administrators, and it created issues for central office. Because the administrators that were towing the line and saying, this is why we're doing this is what we're doing. The teachers of one building were talking to the other building that was doing the book study. And like words spread like wildfire. And then the teachers went to the teachers who found out went to the principal and said, well, so-and-so building doesn't have to do this. Why do we have to do this? So already you can see the domino effect, right? You can totally see the domino effect. The other example is conferences. So I see people going to conferences and being approved for conferences because the people who are approving don't really know enough about scientifically valid practices to know whether or not the conference permission should be granted or not. I'm going to give you one example of this, but I'm going to be careful not to cast a broad brush stroke. But I have seen quite a few sessions at the International Literacy Association that fall under the umbrella of scientifically invalid practices. Not all, but many. And there was one year where teachers came back, and this district adopted Dibble's curriculum-based measures, now referred to Dibble's Next as now Acadian's Reading. But there was, no joke, an evening 4:30, there was a chant, an anti-Dibble's rally. I'm not making this up. I am serious. There was an anti-Dibble's rally. People got into a ballroom. They made a circle. They were chanting. These people, bless their hearts, came back and it's like, what are we doing? This is so bad that there was a rally against it. So you can see how something as innocent as giving people access to PD can create a lot of strife and conflict, internal conflict for the teachers and conflict for the administrators at the building and central office level. So I just want to be very clear. Like, you've got to teach people, but then you also have to safeguard against conflicting messages. So a lot of the superintendents, assistant superintendents, principals, now sometimes will run questions by me or my staff and say, what do you think about X, Y, or Z? Could this be problematic? Now, we don't always know the answer, but there's some things that you can Google, and there's some kind of look for phrases and words that I can pick out and say, ooh, this might be problematic. And then you dig a little bit deeper, and you can get a firm, yes or no. Now, is it possible that we've all experienced conflicting messages, yes or no? Yeah, I think we have, and it's painful. It's painful to experience. It's painful to have to try to lead, okay? So the graphic that is central in this state is around the simple view of reading. And I think the simple view of reading is great. Ironically, I had someone about a couple months ago say to me, oh, the simple view of reading is too simple. And reading is very complex. I agree, reading is complex. I don't agree that the simple view of reading is too simple. The simple view of reading, there are several studies that have actually demonstrated that how effective the simple view of reading is for accounting for reading difficulties. I actually have those studies, so if anyone's interested, I can send them to you. However, I see a lot of people that misunderstand what these domains mean, okay? And so I like to go deeper with Daniel Willingham's work. You may be familiar with a book that he wrote called Reading in the Mind. I strongly recommend Reading in the Mind, and here's why. So I'm not a real technical science math person. I mean, I'm not. Still to this day, I avoid stats like the plague, okay? But in books like Reading in the Brain or Reading at the Speed of Sight, we have a lot of technical terms about the brain and processing, and sometimes if you don't have the depth or breadth of the vocabulary in your lexicon, it is going to impact our comprehension. I mean, think about it. If you were having to read a law journal and you don't have background knowledge about what's there, you find yourself mind wandering and not even paying attention to what you're reading. Daniel Willingham's book is a great first step to start to understand how your mind actually takes information, that is written and actually gets to a point where we understand what it means. So I always encourage folks, if you're going to start somewhere, if you really want teachers to start somewhere, I think reading in the mind is the right way to go. It removes a lot of the technical language out of it. So here are the scientifically valid reading practices, okay? So decoding skills, in the simple view of reading, print concepts, phonological awareness, phonics and word recognition. Anita Archer shared these with you. Sight word vocabulary, fluency. And so these have to be explicitly taught. We have to be using decodable text. Now, I've been in meetings where people have literally screamed when I mentioned decodable text. And I'm not exaggerating at all, And then language comprehension skills, background knowledge, academic vocabulary, narrative language skills, inferential language skills have to be explicitly taught. Now, a lot of people kind of nod when I talk about the importance of background knowledge, narrative language skills, inferential language skills, but don't necessarily understand how much or how little it actually does impact comprehension. And that's where Willingham's graphic, I think, goes deeper and unpacks that. These last two are important as well. We should not be using leveled readers with kids. Now, I'm talking about leveled readers for the purpose of having kids independently read, okay? We should be using leveled readers to teach the vocabulary, to teach some of the comprehension skills. It can be done through listening comprehension, but to hand a student a leveled reader when he or she does not have the ability to decode the words and has not been taught the high-frequency words, it promotes guessing. It absolutely promotes guessing. And so the recommendation is that until a child can read at about a third grade level, you wouldn't want to sit down and say, here you go, read this leveled reader to help with your reading ability. You can't treat it like a decodable text. And so these are scientifically valid reading practices. Now I'm going to juxtapose that to the next slide. I'm going to pre-correct for the fact that I may upset people by doing this. Now I am a Wolverine fan, so I know I already have upset people in the state of Ohio. And so if I'm going to do it, I might as well do it. No, I'm kidding. So I want to be very clear. I was taught to do these things that are scientifically invalid. For those of you who are old enough to remember the 4 Blocks materials by Patricia Cunningham, yep, I owned all of that stuff. And that stuff is predicated on whole language. There was a Guess the Covered Word book. This is back in the day when transparencies were still a thing. And you would have a colorful transparency. You would put the little tiny Post-its. This is when the little tiny Post-its were invented. And you would put them over the bolded word. You would do a picture walk. And then you would chorally read the sentence. And when you came to the covered word, you would insert the word blank. And then you would brainstorm students' guesses about what that word could be based on context. Teacher would write with a vis-a-vis marker down the side. We would expose the initial letter. We would cross off the words that did not, the guesses that did not begin with that letter. And then we would expose the second letter and the third letter until we finally came to the word. And so that is not scientifically valid. That promotes guessing. And that has been disproven time and time and time again in several research studies. Poor readers actually use guessing as a compensatory strategy. You may have heard Dave Kilpatrick say that yesterday, a compensatory strategy. You have struggling students who compensate for their inability to read words, and a compensatory strategy is to guess at the word, is to use pictures to help figure out the word. The other piece of the 4 blocks that has an issue is the word walls with the boxes around the shape of the word. Now, that was just stupid because the theory was we would remember the word based on the shape of the word. Okay, so think of 2 words, okay? So think of like, I don't know, I'm going to say pet, okay? Pet and pit, okay? Or pet and pat. Pet and pat are 2 different words, but if we were to draw boxes around them, would be the same shape. And so just because we know the shape, it does not mean that we have now figured out the word. So like, that just seems like, I just wish I would have thought years ago, I wish I would have seen the flaw in the logic there, okay? But I did not. So I am not here to, I mean, hindsight is 20/20. We all, like you heard Melissa Weber-Mayer say this morning, we all wish we could have some do-overs, okay? And I wish I knew, back then what I know now, and I wish I could have my 32 third graders again, because the instruction would look so different. And what I choose to purchase for my classroom would look so different, okay? So, but now we need to know why. Why are these things here invalid? And why am I telling you that the things on the previous slide are valid? And that's where you start to get into Willingham's work. So Willingham starts the book by saying, okay, starts with a passage. I chose the passage from the book Night by Elie Wiesel. Had to read it in 11th grade, loved it. It was a great book. And I actually had to memorize this passage. I remember that as an assignment. Teacher wanted this famous passage memorized. And so Willingham starts explaining how the mind reads by saying what happens in your mind when you read a passage like this. So he acknowledges reading as a complex skill. He acknowledges that there are things that happen in the mind, and he's not trying to explain why they happen in the mind the way that they do. He's just trying to say this is what happens. And he's talking about what happens when someone who can't, like someone who's able to read. Okay, so in a few minutes, I'm going to talk about some exceptions to the rules, adults who have had strokes, and some of the unintended consequences that can impact reading. So he has 2 graphics in this book. The first one is really talking about how you, quote, read well. And it is this graphic, which you guys have in your PowerPoint. And he's talking about there being 2 pathways that are allowing us to access the meaning of words. So access the meaning of words. And both of these pathways are accessible at all times, okay? Unless you have had a trauma to your brain and something is wrong, then there would be exceptions to the rules. But this is very rare, okay? So there are 2 paths, and if we break down the paths, he says, well, we have to figure out where we start. We have to start with writing, because this is all about writing, right? Words are written on a page that we then need to read. And so he talks about the purpose of writing. Writing is really an extension of memory, an expansion of what occurred. The purpose was to have a more objective account of information. And writing served the purpose of having an accounting of what had happened. It would not be possible for us to have a writing system that is all picture-based. I mean, it certainly wouldn't account for grammar. It certainly would have too many symbols that our minds could possibly remember. Okay, so we had to have a system for writing. And here is really where it begins. Things are written down. We have to be able to access that information. But a point about grammar, and this is a key thing we have to think about, people underestimate the fact that grammar actually is more effortless to learn. We have learned, starting at a young age, now not children who are English language learners. I'm talking about English-speaking students who have grown up hearing the language around them. we have learned how to speak grammatically correct without necessarily really knowing how we do it. You can't, I mean, if I were to ask someone to randomly tell me all the grammar rules that exist, very few people can actually do that. English language arts teachers may, but very few people can actually do that. Grammar was more effortless to learn just because of our oral language and around us. And you even think of kids, for those of you who have kids or grandkids or remember yourself as a child, you know, kids who are just learning how to put ED at the end of a word. Right? I mean, you can think of 2 or 3-year-olds or 4-year-olds that are just trying to grasp the command of our language that can speak grammatically incorrect. So grammar is actually effortlessly learned for the most part. We can speak. We don't know. Now, writing, it's a different story. You heard Steve Dykstra today talk about the challenges of writing. I'm talking about speaking and being able to communicate and read what is on the page and be able to read it correctly. Okay, so the role of spoken language, it really starts here. We start to learn words. We hear words like car, and we can point, little kids can point to a car. Think of like a 1-year-old, 2-year-old. You say car, they can point to a car. Dog, where's the dog? Point to the dog. So that is phonology. We are hearing words in our language. And then we attach those words that we hear immediately to word meaning. So we don't really need instruction in the arrangement of words and phrases to form complete sentences, not necessarily, because we've kind of started to pick that up as, like in terms of how to speak that way, we've picked that up without really knowing how we did it, okay? So reading is built upon the relationship that exists between the sounds that we hear and the meaning of the words, and then it adds a process in which we translate the letters written on the page to the sounds that it represents. That's the issue with our language. English is a really hard language to learn how to read because we have so many letter combinations to produce the same sounds. It's not like Spanish. Spanish is a very phonetic language. Okay, so in English, we have an additional layer of complexity. So the path to meaning is the first path is right here. Okay, so the first thing that I want you to do is I want you to talk to the people next to you for a moment, because I'm going to start explaining what these different pathways are. And I want you to think about your colleagues that you work with or even yourself. To what extent would people benefit from learning more about how we actually read, scientifically valid reading practices? Because I'm going to take you through a process that you may choose to use with your colleagues. Go ahead and talk for a few moments, and then we'll unpack pathway 1. Okay, guys, let me bring you back together. May I have your attention? Okay, so I had a really good conversation about secondary. How much do middle and high school teachers need to know about the source of reading difficulties? So I started this section on the simple view of reading. Now, I didn't go into the slides that really unpack the decoding domain or the language comprehension domain, but when we provide professional learning to middle school BLTs, high school BLTs, even some of our reading strategies, comprehension strategies that we're teaching, we always show the simple view of reading. And the feedback from the secondary teachers has been, thank you, because I've never known why some of the kids that I am working with are struggling. So you've just given me language, words now, to understand why. I think the biggest disservice that we have done to secondary teachers in the response to intervention, MTSS, kind of field, is that we have unintentionally led middle and high school teachers to believe that they have to be expert reading teachers. And when you think back to the coursework that middle and high school teachers take in college, it is typically in their core subject area, right? So math teachers are taking a lot of math courses. There are fewer numbers of courses that are taken around instruction. There are some. There certainly aren't courses that really unpack how to identify, prevent, remediate reading difficulties, okay? And so I really do believe that secondary teachers have been very thankful and have said, you have confirmed some of what I have suspected, but I didn't have the words to actually define it. And I think that that's very powerful. I think that helps with the buy-in at the secondary level. So when we think about this first pathway, it really begins with letters. And we are talking about the letters of our alphabet. Now, the good news is this really isn't a problem. There are 26 letters in the alphabet. So there aren't a lot of discernible differences between good readers, poor readers, when it comes to letter identification, because we can actually teach that. It's manageable. It's 26 letters. But so our letters were designed to include the most common shapes that occur within our environment, okay? So things like this. These right up here are the most common features of letters that make up our 26 letters of the alphabet. And so that is why we can read in any font. You can put it in, truly, and I actually tried this on my children. I do sadly make my children sit through some, like if I need to practice something. But maybe they will know how to teach kids how to read. Who knows, right? But it's true, if you wrote a sentence and you switched out on Word the font, you can use 8, 10 different fonts, same sentence. The features of the letters that make up those sentences are still discernible. So that is why you can change font size, color, and it does not impact our ability to recognize letters at all. Okay, so good readers, poor readers, much more similar than different when it comes to being able to distinguish the letters of the alphabet. Okay, now the problem is in this next piece, and that's our ability to hear the sounds in words and associate certain letters with certain sounds. So people aren't born with this ability to describe the differences in individual speech sounds, individual phonemes. So our ability to say, let me try it. So say sky, change the k to oo. The word is, right? That is not, we are not born necessarily with that ability. That is something that is the greatest concern for students' reading ability. And it's something that is less likely to develop on its own. We have to explicitly teach it. And for those of you who heard Dave Kilpatrick yesterday, he probably talked a lot about that. And so a sound that is supposed to go with a letter in the English language depends on its position to the neighboring sounds. Okay? That is a challenge in our language. So when we think about how we develop the phonology, that word sound development, if we think of the continuum of skills that we teach, we know words are comprised of syllables. We know that words are comprised of onset rhyme, so k, at, okay? Onset is k, rhyme is at. And words are made up of individual sounds or phonemes. K, at, cat, okay? So this is something that if we were going to progressively teach this skill, this is the skill progression. However, we have to understand that the vast majority of reading difficulties, especially students with dyslexia, I think Dave talked to you about that yesterday, they tend to have a phonological core processing issue. They have a hard time hearing and manipulating the sounds that they hear in words. And so students that are struggling readers tend to have problems with both the sounds that they hear, their ability to manipulate those sounds, and the phonics and word recognition. So the ability to decode those sounds and translate the cluster of letters into the corresponding sounds that they make. So Dave talked to you about the distinction between basic phoneme skills and advanced phoneme skills. And so, I've given you some examples here, and I'm sure Dave gave you a lot yesterday, but something that needs to be explicitly taught. The next step, really now, step 3 gets into these translation rules. And so we've got the alphabetic principle. Our letters are made up of individual sounds, okay? It requires us to be able to hear the sounds in words, to be able to then look at the sounds and know what sound that they make. We have to map the letters of the sounds, and it is confusing to our language because English uses what's called a many-to-many matching, meaning you can have different cluster of letters that are put together to make the same sound. I gave you 3 examples here: boat, row, dough. So think of students. Think of the students. It's not easy. I mean, there isn't just one way to make the O sound. English, there's many ways to put different letters together to make that same sound. So Willingham refers to it as a many-to-many matching issue within our English language. Step 4, as we are looking at the letters, we are looking at how those letters are clustered together. We are looking at how they're positioned. We translate those letters into the sounds that they make, the word sounds, and then we start to now map those sounds into our minds. The spelling of words does make a difference. Willingham gives a nod to this. Dave Kilpatrick has given a nod to this. But actually it goes back to Linnea Airy years ago, who gave a nod to the fact that the spelling of words does in fact contribute to our ability to read those words. And so, the bottom line is that we have meaningful strings of letters, IGH or IGHT is a good example, that are strung together. We take that cluster, we map it into our brain. So if we know IGHT says ite, we know light, night, might, sight, right, okay? And so this issue of the spellings really comes in handy. And our other issue with why spellings is important is because the English language has a lot of homophones. So we have night to night, right? I mean, I'm sure you guys could think of a lot of examples. Our language is challenging. It is a function of our language. Spelling is something, though, that we have to pay attention to. And so the words or the sounds that they are learning, the high frequency words, the clusters of letters that come together to make certain sounds, they have to have lots of reading practice in those things. And that's where you get into this concept of self-teaching hypothesis. Now, I have some issues with the title of that. And the next slide is going to talk about it. But the big idea is that you want kids to successfully sound out a new word while they're reading, and we want them to be able to effortlessly, instantly recognize that word so it is mapped into our mind so any word can be instantly recognized like that. And so while sounding out, students briefly interact with the sounds and the letters within a given word. By doing that, it promotes putting it into their memory so they have an orthographic representation of it. and it helps them map that word into permanent memory. Here's the issue with the title. I have had people that say self-teaching means just let them do it. Let them just read. Put them in a book like room or library and let them read. And that's not the purpose. So the self-teaching requires the teachers to carefully design reading practice for students. This is where decodable controlled text comes into play. So the people who scream at decodable text, this is why it's important. You need at least 4 to 8 opportunities to encounter the letter strings that they're working on to make a certain sound and the high frequency words. Kids have to at least come across those words 4 to 8 times for that to be mapped into their permanent memory. Decodable text, controlled text, puts a lot of words in that story that give them that practice, which promotes the orthography, the mapping. So this notion of why controlled text, it is because if we didn't have it, we aren't going to establish what is going to be pathway 2. We're going to have kids that spend more time going from letters, translating those letters to sounds, and then knowing that those sounds together make words, and eventually making the meaning of the words. It's the equivalent to what Steve Dykstra said about swimming. Do you remember he said the kid who's like splashing all around, right, versus the like Michael Phelps type person that's gliding through the water? You may have kids in the short term, like in first grade, that can get to the end of the pool, but one is going to be out of breath. And that one who's out of breath has not had sufficient amount of practice and map those sound associations, those high frequency words, so that he or she can instantly and effortlessly recall those words, so they're mapped onto permanent memory. The kid who's gliding through the water has mastered pathway 1. They've had sufficient practice to get to this purple, orthography bubble. And what you're going to see in the next slide is that it moves into pathway 2. Now, I want to caution you that pathway 2 does not mean that a kid could skip knowing the translation rules. The EA come together and make E. E and A translate into E or E. Okay? It does not mean that you miss this. It just means that the mind has to have both pathways accessible. You can have a kid who can glide in certain parts of a pool, but with new letter sound combinations and high frequency words, kind of briefly turns back into that kid who's splashing all around, right? So this is very systematic, deliberate instruction and practice of letter combinations, the translation rules, what sounds they make, mapping that onto the words that they read so that they understand, so they can make meaning of the words. So I want you to think for a few minutes about your colleagues based on what we've talked about. Pathway 1 to meaning, pathway 2. What might people benefit from hearing? Go ahead and talk for a few minutes and we'll come back together. All right, let me bring it back together. So some people have said, like, where do we start? Like, what happens if we're not doing this? And, you know, so I want to affirm the fact that we all do the best that we can, given the resources that we have and what we know. I admitted that I owned, I don't think I kept it anymore, all of the 4-block stuff. I had the white guided reading book. I brought that on my honeymoon, right? I mean, so like there's a level of dedication if you're bringing that on your honeymoon, right? So, you know, but I appreciate people being in an open space to hear something differently. And where do you begin? I'm a big believer that the decision makers at the district have to be in a place where they want to make a change. Because I do think that there are situations like the letters modules that some of you have access to that talk about the science behind instruction. They talk about how to teach, you know, phonics and word recognition and phonemic awareness. And so that is certainly a place to start. But if you're really talking about a sweeping change across the district, that's where, you know, the district infrastructure comes into play. We do a lot of coaching with superintendents and assistant superintendents and others because a lot of times they too haven't been taught this. And so it's something that doesn't necessarily happen overnight, but it begins with some awareness that perhaps there is a different way of doing things to be able to meet the needs of more kids that are within our schools. So now Willingham gets into the second half, which really starts to unpack the language comprehension, some of the pieces that are in the language comprehension portion of the simple view of reading. And word meanings is really vocabulary. And he talks about the difference between the breadth of vocabulary and the depth of vocabulary when they are not one and the same. And so he gives a nod to the fact that our minds are really good. We are very precise. Our minds are trained to avoid what Willingham calls lexical near misses. The sentence here is a good one. Would you mind spilling water on my plants? Right? Our mind is like, ooh, spilling is not the right word, not the right vocabulary word to use there. Even though that is technically correct, when you're watering a plant, you technically are spilling water on the plant. But that is like a near miss. More and more words are not just packed into our mental dictionaries. We don't have like an unabridged Webster, dictionary that's like yay thick. Instead, there are lots of connections that are made between the words and the knowledge that is in our minds. And so Willingham talks about the breadth of vocabulary and the depth. It is well documented that that kids who have broader levels of vocabulary knowledge do in fact comprehend better, okay? So there is good evidence that shows if we teach vocabulary, that's the academic vocabulary piece of the simple view of reading, then it is going to boost reading comprehension. Now, depth, though, is different. Depth has to do with two things. It is how dense the connections are between words. My oldest loves World War II. He is reading books about World War II. He's watching YouTube documentaries on World War II. He has more than breadth of vocabulary related to World War II. He has depth. So as he's reading and as he's seeing words, he's making, like, the connections are deeper and deeper and deeper related to the content that he's learning, World War II. And what we know is if you have a depth of understanding about the words that you're reading, your speed at which you can access information in your mind is much faster, okay? It's the difference between, like, when I read Reading in the Mind, I had more depth of vocabulary around what was written in that book. So the speed at which I could make connections to reading in the brain, reading at the speed of sight, the letters modules was much faster because I have depth of vocab in this area. Now, if you have me read a mechanics manual or a law journal in something that's related to the medical profession? No. I mean, probably don't have breadth, and I may not even I don't have depth, okay? So, so then Willingham goes below vocab and says, okay, how are words put together when we read them so that we understand the sentences that we read? So he does get into syntax rules. The order and position of words does make a difference. You know, the cat is biting the dog is biting the cat. Same exact words, we've just reordered two of the words, means something completely different. So that does make a difference. We can't deny that it doesn't. At the same time, Dr. Anita Archer would say that she has tried to find research that has shown if we focus instruction on syntax, is it going to make a discernible difference in improving reading outcomes? And she hasn't found a study that, that has a high-quality research design to say with confidence, yes, it warrants teaching. It just doesn't exist. But we can't deny the fact that the position and order of words does make a difference in terms of how we read it. That sentence, same words, means two different things in our minds. The other piece that Willingham talks about is sentence representations. So if we think about a sentence, they are cooking apples. So based on how that sentence is, where it's placed and what the sentence is before or after could have a very different meaning. So what kind of apples did you buy? They are cooking apples. What are Jill and Jeff doing in the kitchen? They are cooking apples, right? So again, sentence representations do impact our ability to understand what we're reading. The other thing that makes a difference are the connections. The network, for those of you who are psych majors or remember social psychology, cognitive psychology, nodes, N-O-D-E-S, this is what we're talking about, idea webs. What we know is that as we read, we increase different connections to different ideas. It's almost like a spider web in our minds. And those are idea webs. And many vocabulary terms or phrases are anchored to these idea webs. And so words, phrases, things that mean the same thing are connected in an idea web. Things that, causal connections. And if a reader lacks background knowledge, they will have incomplete idea webs. So when people say, why are we building background knowledge? You have to build background knowledge because then they're not going to fully be able to understand what you're teaching them. They don't have a solid enough idea web. The last piece is around the situation model. And that's just saying that our mind doesn't store every little bit, tiny detail around the book night, like I started. Our minds create almost like a summary. We create a less complete, but yet it highlights the most important pieces of information. I know enough about Night. I don't know every detail, but I know that it is about the author who was in a concentration camp during World War II. He watched several people die in the concentration camp or at Auschwitz. And so I have a situation model. I know enough to know the gist, but I don't have to remember every single detail. So the bottom line is, this is what Willingham is defining as read well. And so where that fits around motivation is that you have to read well or you can't even begin to be motivated to read. Now, young kids can. Young kids at kindergarten, first grade, they're just starting to read. They have people that, like my first grader still wants me to read to him. That's still cool. But there will come a time where if my 14-year-old couldn't read, he's not going to want mom to read to him, right? I mean, maybe that's my 14-year-old, but I mean, it's just, so you have to read well. However, even kids who read well may not be motivated to read. And that still does impact the breadth and depth of their vocabulary. It does impact it. Logan would rather be on Fortnite. He would rather be playing sports. So the depth of word knowledge, the depth of background knowledge are improved upon if we actually read more. We read well, we enjoy reading, we have a better attitude towards reading, we see ourselves as a reader, we read more often. So this issue of motivation and giving kids access to reading opportunities, totally agree. Totally agree. All I'm saying is that when you have kids that can't read, they can't read well, their motivation is automatically compromised. Okay, but even if they can read well, we still have to figure out ways to motivate them to read, to give them the depth of the vocabulary and the neural network connections. Okay, so it does impact comprehension. So you have with you the final barriers, and I've given you, each barrier is connected with very specific solutions. Related to barrier 2, you have in your Google folder, I've given you a folder that talks about how to select core reading curriculum resources that are matched with scientifically valid procedures. I've also given you an example district process to review, select, and deselect things. So I've tried to map out some steps that you could take to address these barriers. But I had to start with what constitutes scientifically based reading practices. If I didn't, all of these steps to address the barrier are pointless. Okay? I think, how many more minutes do I have left? 1, 2, okay. Okay, yes. The only thing that I'm going to say about administrators is that you have to absolutely continue to systematically deepen the knowledge of your building administrators and of your teaching staff. I'm a big believer that the leaders of the building and the school have to know what constitutes effective versus ineffective practice, and they have to know how to support the heck out of it, support their teachers so that they're successful. Okay, with that said, you've been a great group. I've loved being with you, and I will see you in the networking session. So thank you, guys.